a tall order. These are big shoes to fill, so I appreciate the opportunity. And I will also note, and I think she's somewhere here in the room, that if Rosalind Jacobs calls you at 3:30 in the afternoon one day and says, "Hey, what are you doing tomorrow morning?" you should be prepared to be standing on the stage pretty soon after that. You know, before I get started, I also want to say, you know, this is going to be a fundraising event. You're going to be asked to give. And I'm filling in short notice, so I'm going to do my very best to give you a compelling story. But if I don't, and if you don't like it, write a big check anyway, because I know what it's like to plan events, and these kinds of changes are incredibly stressful on a staff team. So do what you can for the organization. I am the product of the American dream. I'm the granddaughter of immigrants on my father's side. And my father grew up in the kind of poverty that evokes Dickensian images. His father was an alcoholic who was often absent for long periods of time. There was violence in the home. His mother had me think about a 4th grade education, although she didn't speak English very well, so it was hard to understand sometimes. She left her own home when she was a young teenager. She worked hard to provide for her family, but with limited English and 4 children, it was exceptionally difficult in South Philly. And yet, somehow, my father managed to break the bonds of poverty for his children, such that my siblings and I can hardly even imagine the life that he grew up in. It's a hazy picture in the distance. We've all achieved some level of success. All 3 of us have college educations. 2 of us have graduate degrees. I won't comment on which one lacked ambition, but it was not me. It would be easy to look at my dad and say that he pulled himself up by his bootstraps, that he had grit and he was resilient. And all of those things are true to some extent. He's one of the hardest working people I've ever known, and he certainly took advantage of all the opportunities presented to him. But the truth about how my dad beat the odds is a little more complicated than that, I think. And I've spent a lot of time considering how was it that he was able to do that, and what were the factors that contributed to it. First, and I would be remiss if I didn't note this, he was a white man. And while being the son of Italian immigrants in the time he grew up wasn't exactly a ticket to the top, there were some barriers he simply did not face. Second, he had stable housing. So despite the financial challenges, his mother somehow managed to make that rent payment every month, and they lived in the same neighborhood his entire childhood. Now, it meant that he and his siblings had jobs from about the time they were 9 years old. My dad's first job was cleaning out the meat cases at a butcher down the street. He later had a paper route, other things, and it meant that sometimes they didn't have enough food on the table. Being an Italian, my dad is very particular about eating Italian food out because his mother made wonderful Italian food. And you know, gnocchi that we see on menus now, it's like all the rage. That's a poor man's food, and my dad refuses to eat it, right? Because it's potatoes and flour and water, and that's it. And he thinks we are ridiculous for paying $20 a plate. So just think about that the next time you order it. So he had stable housing, which is really critical. Third, he had a decent enough education for the time. He has a high school diploma from a trade school where he learned drafting. He parlayed that into a career in the textile industry for over 50 years. In fact, he's still working some today. Finally, he had people around him who cared about him and showed him a different kind of life, even when those weren't always found in his own family. He talks about his friend Charlie. I think in the South it's Charlie. I think there's an R in there. But he talks about how while they were poor too and lived in the neighborhood, they always had a little bit extra for my dad. And I think they had a kind of family stability that he was able to observe and witness, even again when it wasn't in his own home. So in short, my dad had community around him. He had many of the factors that we now talk about when we say words like holistic and comprehensive and wraparound. He had a community around him. So I've spent much of my career, as it turns out, intentionally or unintentionally, trying to recreate those conditions for children and families in Charlotte. And so have organizations like Legal Aid and the Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy. See, they realize that family stability creates healthy children. And family stability cannot be achieved by addressing issues piecemeal. And often it cannot be achieved for all of those who need it without systems-level intervention and legal advocacy. Some of you have heard me say this, and you're probably going to roll your eyes, because it's one of my favorite things to say. But children do not come in pieces and parts, and they don't exist outside the context of their families and their communities. And so when we think about how to create an opportunity, an environment of opportunity so that children can succeed, we have to consider the conditions under which they are living, both in their physical environment and within their families. So see, we all know, or we were, the kid that beat the odds. And we tend to point to those examples and we say, see, the American dream is still alive. Anybody can achieve it. But here's my problem with that. It puts the burden on the child. And it fails to recognize the systemic and institutional barriers that often stand in the way of success. We are saying to a child, we're going to abdicate our responsibility as a community and hope that you find your way if we leave some breadcrumbs on a trail. And I'm not okay with that. It's our job as leaders and citizens to take care of the most vulnerable among us, and that certainly includes children. And that means we have to care for their families and their neighborhoods. Research tells us that the combination of family poverty and neighborhood poverty significantly increases the risk of negative lifetime outcomes. We know that children living in poverty are more likely to experience all kinds of things, like being retained in school, dropping out of school, being born at a low birth weight, being born prematurely, dying in the first 5 years of life, having a learning disability, experiencing violent crimes, experiencing abuse and neglect, and living with a parent that has a significant emotional or mental health issue. Children's early development depends on the health and well-being of their parents and their families. But the daily experiences of young children that include untreated mental health problems in their families, recurrent exposure to family and neighborhood violence, unstable housing, the threat of deportation, and the psychological fallout of living in demoralized and violent neighborhoods has a significant impact on that development. So that's all pretty depressing, right? You're pretty glad they invited me to come talk to you this morning right now. Hope exists in the organizations that are working to hold accountable the systems that serve children and families in our community. And the organizations that are working every day to preserve the essence of community, which begins with housing. And two of those organizations are the ones that we are here to celebrate today. But this requires us to focus on both the immediate needs of families facing some of the most challenging circumstances we can imagine. Eviction, deportation, lack of access to health care, lack of access to mental health care. But we also have to focus on how to improve the systems, including the policies that have created the conditions under which people are living. And that requires a holistic and long-term approach, and it's difficult. But the good news is these organizations are working every day on both levels, and they are demonstrating true collaboration. You know, we talk a lot about collaboration in the nonprofit world, and it tends to end up being, I've written grants, I know how to answer that question, right? But it tends to be this like laundry list of everybody you've had coffee with, right? Like you had a conversation with somebody this morning, you're gonna add that to a grant application. Oh, we're collaborating. But true collaboration, if there are funders in the room, just ignore that. All of those answers are very legitimate. But true collaboration is when we achieve outcomes together that we otherwise would not achieve individually. And that's what these organizations are doing, and I'm going to give you a real-time example. As you are hopefully aware, and if you're not, you need to go educate yourself on this immediately, we have a serious affordable housing crisis in our community. We have data that was just released a couple of weeks ago that tells us we need 27,000 units of housing for people who earn less than 30% of the area median income. 27,000 units. We are losing ground faster than we can keep up. Existing affordable housing is slipping away every day. The Lake Arbor apartment complex exemplifies this challenge. We have an aging complex that has fallen into disrepair, and through accumulation of events that includes a class action lawsuit, the owners are now going to renovate it or tear it down. It doesn't really matter. All of the residents are being evicted by the end of the year. I'm proud to say that United Way and more than a dozen of our partners have come together to treat this situation as the disaster that it is. This is an emergency management problem. We have 170 households that will be without housing at the end of the year if we do not act. If it was a flood, we would act. If it was a tornado, we would act. And yet, I've had people tell me, as these agencies are out there working every day to help these families, that we are just pouring water into a sinking ship, and that we will not be able to fix it. And I disagree. And I disagree because the work that these organizations are doing disproves that every day. First, they are responding to the immediate needs. They're finding housing, they're addressing the immediate financial concerns, and they're making sure that the rights of these residents are protected every day. Are we going to be able to house all of these families satisfactorily? Is everybody going to end up with a white picket fence? Sadly, probably not. But are we going to do everything we can to get as many housed as possible and ensure continued family stability? Absolutely. Are we going to do our best to ensure that legal rights are protected? Yes. Legal aid is doing an amazing job of ensuring the rights of these tenants are upheld under the law and that they have access to safe housing. Second, through a class action lawsuit and individual advocacy, the Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy is ensuring access to safe housing conditions and also working to reform systemic policies so that we hold owners accountable and prevent future crises like this from happening again. Because here's the thing, the housing stock simply does not exist right now. And we have to preserve the existing affordable housing and keep it safe and keep it affordable for families while we're building new affordable housing. We need to engage in intentional, organized, and systemic advocacy to change the conditions for thousands of individuals, children, and families at once, because we are not going to overcome 400 years of history and the legacy of policies that originated in that history by only helping one child and one family at a time. We cannot talk about building affordable housing and hope that better policy results. We have to create better policy first, especially in neighborhoods that have been disinvested in for so long. And we have to be intentional, focused, and tenacious in that advocacy. And these two organizations are doing that every day. We also have to recognize that this is a long game, and there are going to be ups and downs. Like I said, I can't tell you that the outcome for every resident at Lake Arbor is going to be what we would want it to be. Many of these situations for these families have resulted from a failure in policy and a failure of multiple systems that led to the challenge situations they're living in. But I do hope that through the work of our partners, and particularly legal aid in the Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy, we have elevated this issue to a new level that will not be ignored. I think that on some level, all of this is common sense, right? Why wouldn't we try to build communities that are grounded in family stability? Because it's hard, it's messy, there's not a magic timeline. We like 5-year timelines for things in Charlotte, right? We want everything solved in 5 years. It just doesn't go that way. And because it often involves difficult conversations where we have to confront the darkest parts of our history and acknowledge the damage that has been inflicted. But here's the hope. We have organizations like Legal Aid and the Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy that wake up every day thinking about nothing but how they will protect individual rights and advocate for systemic change. They don't give in, they don't give up, and they represent some of the most vulnerable among us with dignity and respect. Let me close with this. Charlotte is ranked 50th out of 50 in economic mobility. That means if you're born in poverty in this city, the city I was born in and call home, you are likely to live your life in poverty. I run the largest private health and human services funding organization in Charlotte. We are 100% committed to changing this statistic. And yet I also know that we will not program our way out of this. If we want to build strong children, we have to confront our history, speak truth to power, and fully support our partners like the ones here today who are willing to challenge the status quo. This is hard work. Some days are discouraging, but I stay motivated because I've seen what happens when we create an environment of opportunity, when we surround our neighbors with hope and a community that is invested in their success. And I've seen what happens when organizations like these two come together for change. I'm also still hopeful because of my dad. He created a life for me that I didn't do anything to deserve. I just got lucky. Let's not make our future depend on luck. Let's support justice for all. Thank you.